Hello, my name is Cheyenne Graves, and I am a master's student in Dr. Tavickel's Research Lab Urban Water Group, and this will be an introductory lecture on life cycle assessment, which is a method for calculating the environmental impact of a product or service. And here is a photo of Dr. Tavickel and his students in Urban Water Group. Here is a breakdown of the different types of degrees each student is pursuing, and more information can be found on Dr. Tavickel's website. Life Cycle Assessment Overview. So performing LCA on a product means accounting for all the environmental impacts that were produced from cradle to grave over the product's life cycle. So the flow chart displayed is showing each step of the life cycle assessment from cradle to grave, i.e. from the resource extraction to disposal. If this was cradle to gate, which is another option of assessment, it would stop after the building process of product, so the third step in the flow chart. Each gray arrow represents the material and energy needed for that step, and the green arrows represent waste such as emissions and byproducts. ISO 14000 standard and beginnings of LCA. So for those that use life cycle assessment, it is common knowledge that it is part of the ISO 14000 standards, but how did this come to be? So the first LCAs were carried out in the 1960s due to concerns over shortages of raw materials and energy sources. In 1969, Coca-Cola used a similar model for LCA that would shape LCA today when they analyzed different soda containers for lowest releases to the environment and which containers use the least resources. So after that, the use of LCAs took off, but due to inappropriate use of LCAs in the 1990s, a uniform method to ensure actuality of information was called for, and life cycle assessment standards for the International Standards Organization, ISO 14000, were created. Inappropriate uses include skewing results by taking certain parts of processes out of the life cycle assessment that would show better results than what was actually true. So now the benefits of life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is used most often for comparison. So the number one benefit would be when comparing two competing products, it can aid in selection by showing environmental impacts caused by each. It identifies processes that will contribute to environmental and human health degradation. And it conveys the amount of resources needed in a process so that actions can be taken to reduce the resource consumption. It helps promote sustainable design by allowing for easier redesign of environmentally taxing processes. So we will be looking at LCA software examples, but before that, in order to better understand the LCA steps, take a moment to fill in the blank inputs, processes, and outputs with ideas from the word bank to the left. Okay, so now I'm going to display the answers. So the first input would be raw material. The second would be energy. The processes that occur would be acquisition of raw material, manufacturing/operations, and recycle and waste management. The outputs would be air emissions, water emissions, soil emissions, and solid waste. So now we're going to go over the ISO 14040 standard. At the end of the presentation, we are going to go over an example, which will go over the 4 steps of the ISO LCA standard. But for now, it's just to understand what each of the blocks in the figure to the left are referring to. So goal definition and scoping. Here you ask yourself what product/process do you want to analyze? And then boundaries for analysis, so either cradle to grave or cradle to gate. And then which environmental impacts do you want to look at? For example, global warming potential. The second step is inventory analysis. So this is going to be your inputs and outputs. Inputs include resources and energy used, and outputs would include emissions, waste, discharge from the system or process, or waste that will need to be disposed of. The third step is going to be impact assessment. So the impacts of products or processes that are discharged to or taken from the environment. And the last step is interpretation. So the results of the inventory analysis and impact assessment will be examined, and further actions will be decided based on the results. So now I'm going to talk about how to run LCA with 2 different types of software that are available to you. So a very simple approach is Carnegie Mellon's Economic Input-Output Lifecycle Assessment. You can just go to the website and it's pretty simple to use. And then a popular approach to run LCA is process-based modeling. So an example would be Gabby software, which is an LCA modeling software that is process-based. It assists in data collection for products and processes, and it contains the life cycle inventory of the products, so it can calculate all material and energy consumptions and emissions/waste that were used and produced. So Gabby is free to students. You do have to fill out a form and get a professor's signature, but you can get a free year trial if you're interested in that. So now we're going to use the Economic Input-Output Lifecycle Assessment software provided by Carnegie Mellon University. So the display looks like the box down to the lower left, and in those boxes we would fill in answers 1 through 4. So our question is, how much greenhouse gases will be emitted in manufacturing 100 $20,000 cars in 2002. An example of that car would be like a Honda Civic. So, like mentioned before, using the answers displayed 1 through 4, we would input those into the 4 different sections of the Carnegie Mellon's model. And a result that you would get is similar to the one over to the right. So this is the metric tons of CO2 equivalent used in automobile manufacturing. So we can see that the most CO2 would be emitted from the power generation and supply of building these 100 Honda Civics. So this is how everything would appear once inputted to the Carnegie Mellon EIO LCA model. So this tool can be used for businesses that make combinations of different products, like a manufacturer that builds different car models and needs to build different buildings/structures for manufacturing. So for our second LCA example problem, we're going to be doing a flow model for a pair of jeans. So flow models are how process-based LCA software works, so such as the Gabby software. So what you're going to do, once again using the word bank to the left, is you're going to fill in the different processes that occur before the products in the orange arrows and this is going to be a cradle to grave process. So take about 30 seconds to fill in each of the processes, and then I'll go over the answers. Okay, so the first process before cotton would be the cotton production. The second process would be fabric production. Once we have our cotton, we can then make the denim. Following denim would be garment manufacturing for the jeans themselves. And then transportation and distribution of jeans to stores. The next phase would be the consumer phase, so once they're bought and being used. And the last phase would be end of life cycle. So now we're going to view Gabby's flow model example. So Gabby calculates potential environmental impacts based on plans. A plan represents a system and its boundaries. So at the bottom, you can see that the entire flow chart is the plan. The systems under study are made up of processes, i.e. the gray boxes, which are the processes taking place to create a product. The flows, the blue arrows, represent all the material and energy passing between different processes. And the reference quantity usually used for flow is mass. So now we're going to review a Gabby plan, the example being a paper clip, and we're going to go over each of the processes in the flow model. So the first would be steel production, which is a part of resource recovery. Following that, the steel would then go into steel wire production to turn the raw steel into a rod. After which, we could assume it would be transported, and then an input into transportation, you will need to account for the diesel used in the trucks. There would also be clip forming, so bending the rod into shape with electricity, and the electricity would also be another input into this process. The fifth process would be the use phase, and then there would be end of life cycle. As we can see, the blue arrow is going back up into the steel wire production. So the seventh process would be recycling, so steel goes back into production, which can be done with this because steel is recyclable. If we had an object of non-recyclable material, it would then end on the end of life cycle. So now we're looking at a flow plan for a paper clip that weighs 0.35 grams. So as mentioned earlier, two of the benefits of life cycle assessment are comparing products and resource management. So in this example, we're going to look at what happens when we take a 0.35 gram paper clip and have the amount of material needed, therefore making it with 0.17 grams of steel, and is there any environmental benefit we can interpret from our flow plan here from doing this. So now here is our Gabby flow plan for the hat paper clip. Everything is exactly the same except for the amount of material being used for this process. So here we have the results calculated from Gabby from both flow plans. So you can view the emissions due to a certain process, for example the end of life cycle, which is displayed here. So the arrows are pointing to the amount of electricity used for each paper clip. So there was a lowering in material use, such as from 0.035 to 0.17, but this did not have a significant impact on the amount of electricity needed to be used in the process. There was, however, a 42% drop in global warming potential, but because of the material usage drop, there is now a drop in the durability of the paper clip. So this would also need to be considered by the company. And for reference, global warming potential is a measure of how much heat a greenhouse gas traps in the atmosphere relative to carbon dioxide. So now that we've gone over some basic LCA examples and we have gone over LCA software examples, we're going to go over LCA application to stormwater management, which is what the Urban Water Group's research focuses on. So traditional design of stormwater management is centralized, it is costly and energy intensive, and it is composed of concrete and steel, i.e. gray infrastructure. So now we're going to go over the modern design of stormwater management. So this includes decentralized systems, which replicate natural systems, and they are often more cost-effective than centralized stormwater management and have low environmental impact. They are able to manage polluted surface water runoff through collection, storage, and cleaning before allowing it to be released slowly back into the environment. And this type of infrastructure is called green infrastructure. So green infrastructure are engineered to manage wet weather impacts and provide community benefits. A green infrastructure example that we are going to go over is rainwater harvesting. So rainwater harvesting has two major benefits, and that is controlling stormwater. So by reducing the amount of stormwater that goes to the streets by collecting it from roofs, we're able to reduce flooding in areas such as San Diego, which is actually highly prone to flooding. And it is able to supply indoor water demand, which for an area such as Southern California with high levels of drought, this is also a good way to reduce water demand overall. Okay, so now we're going to go over the ISO 1400 standard or a rainwater harvesting barrel using the 4 steps that we had gone over earlier. So the first step, goal definition and scoping. So the first question we want to ask ourselves, what product does process? So the product that we're going to be analyzing is a rainwater harvesting barrel. The boundaries for analysis. So the boundaries that we're going to use are cradle to grave, so resource extraction for parts until rainwater harvesting barrel is no longer usable and needs to be disposed of. And then which environmental impacts? The 2 impacts that we're going to specifically be looking at are global warming potential and ecotoxicity to water from building this barrel. Now the inventory analysis, so the inputs and outputs. So inputs include resources and energy use. So the resources here used in energy would be aluminum, electricity, any type of welding material needed to close up this barrel. And then outputs would be the same as our impacts. So what we're looking for is global warming potential and ecotoxicity to water. So now for the third part, we're doing impact assessment. So the impacts of a product or process that are discharged to or taken from the environment. For this part, you're going to need a database, which is provided below. This database was from Tracy, which is an environmental impact assessment tool. It provides characterization factors for life cycle impact assessment. It can be applied to processes, products, facilities, companies, and communities. So we can see in the second column all of the inputs needed to build the rainwater harvesting barrel, and then the third column is how much of each of these inputs we need. And then our outputs are to the right, our global warming potential and ecotoxicity to water. So Tracy is able to tell us based on the amount of each input what those 2 parameters are going to end up being. Okay, so now for the last part of the ISO standard, which is interpretation, we are going to go over the results for ecotoxicity to water. So we have 2 different scenarios displayed on the graph. The first is TF, which is using the rain harvested water for toilet flushing. And the second is HRR, which is high release rate for flood control benefits. So you wouldn't actually use the captured rainfall. It would just release it at small increments so that there is less flooding around the area wherever these rain barrels are. So, for both scenarios, combined sewage treatment creates more impact to the ecotoxicity of water. And then for TF, potable water treatment and CSOs detract from the impacts of ecotoxicity to water. For HRR, since water is not being used indoors, there is no need for potable water treatment, and only CSOs are detracting from the impact of ecotoxicity to water. So it can be interpreted from the graph then that the better option would be to use rain harvested water for toilet flushing. Okay, so thank you for listening to this life cycle assessment presentation. If you do have more questions, we do have 2 papers linked at the end of the slideshow that go over life cycle assessment of rainwater harvesting and life cycle cost estimation of rainwater harvesting. Thank you.